So one of the things that we can do, which is kind of cool, but has its trade-offs, is we can use rasters to describe discrete things on the Earth's surface. And you'll notice, as I've said, obviously it's nowhere near as accurate as vector data can be. Just it's inherently going to be less accurate than that. But if we needed to, we could convert almost any form of vector data into a raster if that works and is necessary for our analysis, bearing in mind the trade-off of accuracy. So if you look at that land use raster on top, you'll see the boundaries between different land use categories. In this case, there's several different land use types. Perhaps one's a neighborhood, one's a forest, one might be agricultural. All right. It's not doing a really good job of describing the boundaries that we know exist there because of that roughness of the cell size. It cannot be as accurate as a vector polygon describing areas. But it is still a discrete version of data where each of the cells that are blue have a value of 10, each of the cells that are pink have a value of 14, and so on. And so we can use it for analysis. It's not as pretty, not as accurate. However, if most of our information most of the other information we're using in our analysis is in raster format already, then if we need to convert one or two data sets from vector to raster, then you say, well, maybe that's a trade-off that I'm willing to accept in order to take advantage of what rasters can do for us. If you look down on the lower example of roads, you can see, again, as I mentioned before, not so great at depicting linear features. And it's just really messy when you convert high detailed linear features to a raster. Where is the road inside the raster? In each cell, where is that thing physically located in space? You're losing that precise measurement that someone made either using a streaming GPS in a vehicle or tracing the outlines of roads off of satellite images or converting a surveyor's work from surveying equipment into a GIS data set. So, if you needed to, you can. You do have that trade-off of you're losing that accuracy of the road, but you're gaining the ability to incorporate it into your raster analysis so it'll function in raster analysis relatively easily. Rasters are much better suited for describing continuous data or surfaces. And that term you would see in GIS and remote sensing literature quite often. A surface, whenever they describe that, normally they're talking about raster data. And it's continuous in that it shows the landscape without any breaks, or it shows some phenomenon that's related to the Earth's surface in some way with no breaks, no real discrete objects being shown. On the top one, what we're seeing is a digital elevation model of a location. And we can see that it's describing the peaks and the valleys and flatlands very nicely. Each one of the cells, if we zoomed in on it, we'd see it's a certain cell size. It has a value of elevation in it. And it's one of the more common workhorse rasters that we use will be a DEM. Below that is a different kind of a raster, and it's one that was generated from vector data. And what we're doing down there is we're calling for a function called distance. And each cell is measuring the distance of that cell from the nearest road. So maybe it might be a 30 meter again cell size, which is the most common cell size used in landscape level work. Um, so each of those different colors represents a band of the same distance away from the nearest road. So maybe 30 meters, 60 meters, 90 meters, 120 meters, and so forth, until you get to the maximum distance that's possible from the density of the road network. Okay, and for some applications, that's something we need to know. How far away is this space in zones from the linear feature? So from a roadway, from a stream. If we're interested in looking at perhaps some species, in that species we know tends to find denning sites within 90 meters of a stream, then this kind of a characteristic we can generate from the streams, and we'll know all the locations in our study area where that type of landform occurs. Okay, so and it creates this thing, creating a distance grid. Then does that as a surface, so it's continuous, doesn't have any breaks. It's based upon the stream or the road network. And so again, most rasters are continuous, showing information across space, and information that is not only continuous across space, but it's continuously changing its values across space. So a DEM, for example, will have perhaps each cell having a different value. You may have some that are adjacent to each other that have similar values, sometimes identical values. If it's a flat area, for example, in a very large flat area, at any given elevation, then the cells are going to be the same value. But typically, you're going to find a little bit of variation between each one, which makes sense if you look out at a landscape. Look at a mountain. What are all the different areas on a mountain that are exactly the same elevation? You're going to find those occurring in bands along the sides of the mountain as you move up the slopes of the mountain to the peak. If you're familiar with topo maps, then this is what contour lines are doing, is describing different elevations of equal value around that object of the mountain. In a DEM, again, because it's not as accurate, it's a little bit more messy, but each of those cells has a different value in it of elevation. So down below, we've got an example of a grayscale black and white air photo. And there, the pixel values are showing us something about the color in black and white coming up off of the surface. And since it's an image of the surface, we can see characteristics in it, the roadway, buildings. You get the hint of some vehicles. This air photo is taken a far enough distance away from the Earth's surface. It's hard to make out fine details. We get a sense of what the landscape is doing, and there's no breaks in it. Okay, again, these are continuous. So a satellite image within the image is continuous. An air photo taken out of a plane or maybe a drone these days will be a continuous image with differing values, usually for those types of imagery. The combinations of red, green, and blue to make color, or the grayscale combination if you're taking an image in black and white. Another way that we can create rasters beyond using remote sensing technology, which is where most of them are coming from these days, is to take old maps and scan them using scanning technology. And that actually produces rasters of grid cell sizes that we can then apply geographic coordinates to and use as at least a visual form of analysis. in GIS systems. So we can take older topo maps, scan them, store them as raster images, and then at least we can display them within GIS systems to see what the landscape looked like at the point in time that the map was made. These things are called digital raster graphics. So they're formed, or they come from paper products. They're scanned um, with a drum scanner. Sometimes it's just a digital picture someone takes with a high resolution camera, and then converting that into a raster with geographic coordinates makes it something that we can, at minimum, again, display, maybe as a background image, something that we can compare and use as an historical reference in our analysis. And so here you kind of run into a problem: is it discrete or continuous data? The digital raster graphic like this it's a raster um, showing at a certain resolution all of these polygon, point, and line features. So it's vector data that's kind of being shown as a raster because now it is a raster, but we can't really do analysis on it. There's nothing to it. It's just like a photo you take with your camera. It doesn't really have a whole lot of information in it that we can use to analyze anything other than it's showing us something. So a digital raster graphic is pretty limited in what we can do with it, except that we can use it as a reference map. So other forms of rasters can also be used and brought into GIS systems. In this case, what we're looking at is a weather map shown on the web. It potentially could be downloaded as it is as a raster graphic, or perhaps taken as a screenshot on the computer monitor. And that image, that raster, can be brought into GIS, and we can actually apply geographic coordinates to it through a process known as georeferencing or geocoding. So if you look at the image, you'll notice there's state boundaries. Some of the major highway systems. Now we can take that information in this image here, and if we go point by point and match them up with a existing GIS data set that has geographic coordinates, we can apply those geographic coordinates to this image and then transform it into something that works in our database. And again, like with a digital raster graphic, it becomes something that we can use as a reference material. We can't really do analysis with it. It's the pixels in that kind of a raster here are only filled with values of red, green, and blue that we're seeing on the screen. That's the only thing that we're going to find in them. Like a scanned DRG, it's only red, green, and blue values for the visual characteristics. And here we'd only get those same values. But we can take any map that we find on the internet, basically, or that someone gives us for whatever reason. If it's related to our study area where we're doing our analysis, we can convert it into something that can be displayed in GIS. And perhaps it has information on it that we can use to interpret better the phenomena that we're analyzing in our study. So we've got here that break those two things down. We've got value rasters, which do have information that's environmental information or about the Earth's surface, or demographic information about populations on the Earth's surface, human populations or animal populations, plant populations, whatever. Those rasters are things that we can use for analysis. And a general picture raster is something that we really can't do much with other than inspect it to see where did this particular thing occur We can't use it in any kind of numerical analysis. But if it had information that we could potentially use for understanding other environmental data, then that has some value to it in our study. Most of the time, picture rasters are just used as backgrounds. Sometimes they're used for understanding context about an area, but there's nothing really numerical that we can do with them. We don't really have a great analytical need for strict picture rasters. And those would be the digital raster graphics and digital maps that, again, you find on the internet and then convert into a GIS data set. It is a data set that you can display, but you really can't do analysis on it. So pretty much, as I'm saying here, and then the second bullet point, you use them as background photos for your analysis, or you display something over the top and use them that way. So getting back to the idea of resolution with raster data, if we move from a coarser cell size, so 90-meter resolution cell size, meaning that each side of each square is 90 meters, and you move to a larger scale, 10-meter resolution, so the side of each square is 10 meters, storage space increases by the square of the resolution. And we'll find some other formulas for that later. Basically, it takes up a lot more space on the disk, exponentially more space on the disk to describe the same area at finer resolution. So moving from 90 meter to 10 meter is going from coarser resolution to finer resolution. And it's cool. It's pretty cool. Depending on what the data is, you're getting closer and closer to describing things that we, at a scale that we might experience as humans walking on the landscape. But it takes up massive amounts of information, storage space on our hard drives or other storage systems. So that's another trade-off that we have these days, where we're actually producing information at such incredibly high resolution, we run out of storage space for them, and we run out of the ability of some of our workstations actually have trouble running analysis on very, very high resolution data. Some of the air photo images that we're able to get might be 0.6 inches on a side rather than 10 meters. So if you can imagine, that's an incredible amount of resolution describing the Earth's surface. And a raster just showing you one house can take up as much room as a 10-meter grid showing an entire county. So if when you start working at finer and finer resolution, you wind up needing more and more powerful computing resources and tons of storage. With rasters, in general, each raster contains one form of information. We're going to need one raster for each attribute. So if we're trying to describe, here on this slide, an example of roads, multiple attributes about the road, we might need one raster for each of those attributes. If it's in the standard type of a raster grid, some rasters allow you to store multiple attributes per raster, like vector data does with vector tables. ArcGIS grids and some of the other data formats will allow you to do that. Many grid formats are limited to single variables. So when you get familiar with, in more advanced classes, not this class, but in more advanced classes, you learn how to generate rasters that contain more than one variable. For the most part, you're going to be provided with rasters that contain single variables. Some of the rasters will contain multiple variables. and we'll learn how to deal with them, but we won't be learning how to generate the multiple attribute rasters in this class. That's a more advanced technique.